Okay, we're going to begin now the second part of our program. And this program is going to be looking at some of the major organizations that were floating around on the surface of the first part of the program. But now we're going to get a little bit more deeply into these organizations. The Federation of State Humanities Councils, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the state councils. Let's just go back and self-introduce before we begin. Kristina, you want to get us let's...
I'm Kristina Valaitis. I'm Executive Director of the Illinois Humanities Council. I'm in my 20th year as the director, but my 30-some year as being on the staff. And I have been to, well, since I started in 1979, I think I've been to all but 2 Federation meetings.
I'm Jim Veninga. I was the executive director of the Texas program from 1974 to 1997. Since 2000 to 2012, I was in Wisconsin working with the University of Wisconsin colleges. And it was extraordinarily interesting to me, and I may make some comments on this, to kind of come full circle in terms of returning to university life. And and the application of things learned in the state program in terms of university life. So,
I'm Carole Watson. My real job is Deputy Chairman at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Since May, I've been acting as chairman. I came to NEH in 1978 as a program officer in what was then called the Office of State Programs.
I'm Jamil Zainaldin. I'll be chairing the session. I formally got involved in the work of the Humanities Councils as president of the Federation beginning in 1986, and for the past 15 years have been executive director of the Georgia Humanities Council.
Esther Mackintosh. I'm the current president of the Federation of State Humanities Councils. Worked with Jamil for 11 lovely years when he was president, and he hired me.
It's one of his smarter decisions, I would say. I'm Rob Vaughan. I'm the president of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. I've been there since January the 21st, 1974, so we're getting ready to celebrate our 40th anniversary as well. And just commenting on what Jim was saying, he said he made full circle from the college to the state councils, back to the college world, now back to the state councils here today. I never left the academic world. I taught for 35 years while I was president of the while I am president of the Virginia Foundation as well. So, as I said at the outset, I like having a foot in both worlds.
Jamil, also, I'm currently on the Federation board, and Rob has chaired the board of the Federation.
89 to 91, I think.
Yeah. First executive director of the board, as I recall.
Yeah.
Yes. And this is the second half of a 2-part program. This morning we had some conversation about the State Humanities Councils and their founding, and that also drifted into some conversation about NEH itself. And while that time went by very quickly, although we feel as if we barely skimmed the surface, and I think that there may be some things that came up in that first conversation that we may want to bring into the second. So I think we're allowed to do that, and as we go forward. Let me just, again, thank Humanities Texas and Mike Gillette and his board for convening this, and I also want to thank, obviously, the LBJ Library for hosting us, but I also want to thank Mike especially for the tremendous work that I think he has been doing to preserve, archive, and make available for posterity some of the things that we have been hearing about through oral histories and whatnot, as well as this program here. Let me just go ahead and state the obvious to those of us here at the table. This group of people will probably never be together again on this subject, and everybody here has been chosen because of some key role they played in the history and the development of the Humanities Councils and of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And much of the information that you're hearing, because people are busy, and in some cases they continue working for federal agencies, is not information available in books. Maybe one day, if we all do our job in our retirement, some of this will be available. But I think what we learned in the first part of the program is that some very significant things happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s in American history, and it does come around to NEH and the State Humanities Councils. And so I think these are, in fact, stories worth preserving and thinking about as we go forward into the 21st century. I'd like to begin by asking each of you to say a few words, and please, pick the general area that you want to talk about, and take a few minutes and get us started. Rob, I'm gonna ask you to begin.
Well, I met, and actually two people have reminded me of it, and none of us can get the exact words right. But I meant to mention Anne Fure Scott and her contribution. Many of you will know her as a significant American historian and one who was a leader in the development of women's history, and going back into the 60s even. She made a talk at one of our programs, one of the Foundation's programs, that was actually held at the one of the museums in D.C. And at the end, and I'm going to go back and look this up and make sure I've got it, she said that she was convinced, this would have been about 1990, 95, that when people in the future look back on the second half of the 20th century, that they will remember the development of the state humanities programs and the work that they had and continue to do as among the most significant developments in the history of the country. I need to get the wording exactly right. It's too good a statement not to know precisely what she said, but I found it rather stunning at the time. And I think, in retrospect, I think she's probably right, that the work that these councils have and are doing, and the role of the NEH in developing them at the outset, of the Congress at allowing, permitting, endorsing, what's the right word here? Endorsing, certainly, this kind of work for the humanities, for scholarship, for the academic community, and its engagement outside of study, as Esther was talking about this morning, but as doing, is significant and will continue to be as we go forward.
I wanted to continue, and I know we'll have time in the course of this to do this too, but I wanted to just continue a little conversation about the origins of the Federation, because I think that those origins have so much to do with where councils are today in how they do their work and relate to each other. So as I said earlier, one of my great privileges is that I get to sit in my office and look at a lot of documents from the Federation years. When I first came to the Federation, it was to start a newsletter. In Minneapolis, they had a journal, of course, and when we moved the offices to Washington, D.C., the decision was made that didn't really need a journal anymore, but Jamil wanted to have something, some vehicle for communicating with councils, and so he asked me to create this newsletter, and so I did. And every issue of the newsletter, I would talk about council events and programs, but I would always interview someone. And so in 1987, which was the 10th anniversary of the councils of the Federation, I interviewed about a dozen people who had been involved with the formation of the Federation. And and then I just collected these little snippets of things under themes, which wasn't a history by any means, not a history of the Federation or the early days of the Federation even, but just people's perceptions about what they were about at that time. And when I look back at those this past week, I was really, really struck by how those perceptions of what people thought they were doing at that time have just really not just persisted, but sort of blossomed. What everybody thought they wanted out of a federation, and also what they thought about where the councils were going and how a federation could help with that, I think has just become more and more realized. But I'm going to ask your indulgence. I'm especially going to ask Jim Veninga's indulgence, because he was one of the people that I interviewed for that issue. And when I looked at what Jim said about why the Federation seemed necessary, it seemed to just encapsulate what everybody else was trying to say. Jim said it best. Here's what Jim said. A lot of us out in the States saw a need for exchange of information and other kinds of services. Equally important was a recognition of the need to see this whole endeavor as a national program and to provide a forum for reflection on that national program and how to achieve the goals that had been set by Congress. Thirdly, probably, was a recognition of the need to somehow balance federal power with that power that belonged to the councils or the states. And there was a need for some kind of collective voice on the part of states in approaching the endowment or approaching the Congress. And that seems to me to sum up really all of the reasons that the Federation got created, and all of these in various ways are ways that the councils have continued to build on their connections with each other.
Carole?
Well, I'll start by kind of going back a little bit in time. I wasn't able to mention this element in the thinking of the endowment in the early years. And we talked about public policy, and John Barcroft said that the moral urgency of this program is because of the connection of public policy, public issues, and the humanities. That's what gives it moral urgency. And then if you look a little bit later, there was another kind of urgency, and it was political urgency. The 50 state councils were formed in about 5 years, which is an enormous effort, as you can imagine. And at that point, the conversation had to do with quality, effectiveness, and impact. But as I think back to this moral urgency, there was a need, as Esther and others have mentioned, for this to be taken seriously. And if you're taking it seriously, you do share best practices. You do share understandings of what doesn't work. And you do push for change. And part of that push had to be people who were given this charge in the states coming back to NEH and saying, this doesn't work. We need more money for this effort. We would like, from what we have learned, to develop model programs ourselves and not just serve as a re-granting mechanism for NEH. So I think that thread of urgency, that this is important and let's do it, is what finally, over time, led the states to come together as a network with the Federation, leading the way. But yet again, I was there, and recall in the early years, the Federation was supported financially by the NEH. The national meetings were paid for by the endowment. NEH staff and the Federation leadership designed the annual programs. So yet again, there was a linkage there that I think has been lost to our kind of oral history and our understanding of those early years. Again, the staff of the small 5 program officer staff at NEH, founding director was there. The executive for state programs was the founding chairman of Oklahoma. So I think there was more sense of we're in this together, we have different roles, we may not agree, than we might be aware of it at this point. And it's always been a dance. We're still dancing.
Jim?
Let me make two comments, one about NEH and higher education and the other about the Federation. The NEH, if you asked, how did it happen that NEH was created, you have to go back to 1964, to the National Commission on the Humanities. You have to go back to the professional societies in the humanities, what they were doing. They were issuing a lot of reports that the humanities in this country really do need federal help and that something needs to be done. And it was that pressure that ultimately resulted, I think, in the creation of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, we see the direct benefit of that encouragement in the fellowships program, for instance, at NEH, but you also see it in this encouragement for scholars to be active in public life. I think everybody in this room who's had experience with the public humanities, and that's everybody, can probably tell a story about the impact of these dollars on individual lives of scholars in the humanities, where it really made a difference to a junior scholar or a senior scholar to become involved in the magic of a public humanities program that really worked. There are stories there. I remember so well a story of one professor in Texas who was up for tenure, did not get tenure. He became involved in public activities, and I will tell you, he became a best-selling author. And you would know his name if I mentioned it. So this program has had enormous impact on scholars. What I learned when I went to Wisconsin, and I was the CEO and campus dean of one of the liberal arts colleges in Wisconsin in Wausau, is how difficult it is for the university systems to give credit, to honor and respect this public work. We still have a long way to go in terms of encouraging regents, encouraging chancellors to say, this work is important. It needs to be acknowledged. We did some things in Wisconsin, and because of the position I held, I was able to encourage this. We created a University of Wisconsin Center for Civic Engagement, a real focal point where scholars who are interested in public work could find an avenue for that work, could find support for that work. And we created the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, in part for the same reason, to give a real identity to scholars engaged in this public work, and students, to encourage students to also be involved in public programs. So some progress can be made and has been made in Texas and other parts around the country. But I think we have to keep at it. I think it's a never-ending process that we have to talk to members of the Board of Regents, to chancellors, and encourage them to find a way in which this work gets recognized, gets recognized for tenure purposes and promotion. So that's one point. I think that the original intent of NEH can't be completed until that process happens. We got to make that extra step so that this public work really is endorsed by the higher education establishment in the country. And the second point builds on Esther's comment. To some extent, I see the Federation as it came along as helping us build a story about the Humanities Councils. And this relates to Betty Sue's work over a lifetime, drawing upon Joseph Campbell and the imagination and storytelling and everything else that you do, Betty Sue, but that to some extent the Federation came into being so that we could help tell a story about who we are and where we want to go and what we want to be. And I think that has been a major step forward. I think we got to keep working on that. We got to continue to find ways in which that impact can be documented in terms of what happens to communities that engage in this public work, also what happens to scholars who get involved in it. So a little more reflection, a little more ways of finding out how we can document the good work that's going on and to really use that to create the ability to tell the story and also the ability to change patterns of behavior, should I say, within the university.
I just want to say 2 or 3 things about, what the world looked like, 40 years ago in terms of the humanities and in terms of the word public humanities, which we love and we still wrestle with exactly what that means and what that looks like. We take for granted these days that there will be reading discussion groups about books in libraries. We take for granted that when there's a major exhibit or a small exhibit somewhere, that there will be collateral materials, there will be lectures and discussions and reimaginings. Well, when we began this work, nobody knew the humanities could be public. I mean, they didn't really know that you could participate other than reading Emily Dickinson in the attic and, enjoying it or going to college and doing that. And I don't think that the councils were the only ones that helped that, what we take for granted now grow so that the humanities are public. I mean, everyone knew the arts were, but no, they didn't know we were. But I think we played a really, really important role in making sure that those experiences were accessible. And a related point is the national conferences that the Federation has been responsible for these many years. For somebody just coming out of the academy, even wanting to come out of the academy all those years ago, who was used to the meetings of the Modern Language Association, the American Historical Association, and going to them as a budding scholar or whatever, and how horrible they were, and how daunting and whatever. The first meeting of the Federation, national meeting of the Federation, was like a breath of fresh air. Not only were there scholars, but there were people who worked for humanities councils. There were people who worked in collateral organizations. There were people from the NEH. It just had such a different feeling, and none of it was proprietary. There has never been anyone in this work that just didn't give their work away and share it. And that, it's very hard because I'm sure even the professional organizations have been altered by that. But it's very hard to capture what an exciting stew and petri dish and everything that was. And the one thing that I related to that I would like us to think about or work on at some point, or maybe it's just a little musing that I'll make, is that in some ways we were part of the birth of a new profession, which is not just public history, but which is public cultural work. And I remember when I started working at the Illinois Humanities Council, and a board member took me for lunch and said, and I was only there for 6 months and still learning what the humanities, public humanities could be. Well, you better start thinking about where you're going to go next, What else are you going to do? Are you going to look for a position at a university? Even the people who are managing the boards were trying to look out for you, but in a way that suggested that we hadn't quite become, or we were in the process of becoming. And I think there's no surprise that there was a confluence, and I'm not a sociologist or whatever, but a confluence of the baby boom, going to college and graduate school, and coming out with a university that had students, the birth rate was dropping and there weren't enough students. A confluence of that with all as Jamil had mentioned so many times, all the turmoil, social and political turmoil in the 60s, that those things would come together, not only in the people who served on the boards of the councils, but who staffed the work of the councils and tried to implement the vision, the broad sort of public vision that NEH's authorizing legislation put out. And there was the creation of culture worker, or whatever you want to call it. But it was, I think, if not a new profession in the way sociologists would talk about it, a new avenue for linking, even in a personal work, the academy and the uses of the humanities for the public. And maybe we still don't have time to be thinking of it in that way, and it's a lot broader. But I think it's a real accomplishment in the Federation. In supportive activities such as the National Conference, in which these things could be expressed, played an important role in that as well.
I'm going to say a few words about the Federation because I was hired right when the Federation moved from Minnesota, the heartland, to inside the Beltway, and that was in 1986. But before I do, let me just tell the panel where I think the next question may go, and you can kind of be thinking about this, since what I'm going to be saying you all already know about, and that is, if we could reinvent the Federation of State Humanities Councils and NEH and the state councils today, and based on all that we've been through and what we understand in the future, what would it look like? What would we do? How would the Federation, how would the councils, how would the NEH work together? Not to say that they're not working together now, but if we were to really take what we have heard so far and strengthen it for the stormy times ahead, certainly in terms of finances, what could we do to strengthen this whole enterprise that we're calling public work? While you're thinking about that, I'll say a few things about this sort of constellation, three organizations. When I came to the Federation in 1986, partly because I got this wake-up call working in a public humanities program supported by the DC Council in a senior center, and was lucky enough to get the job when the job was advertised. What was happening among the councils is that there was a decision to move their membership organization, created both from some desire within the humanities councils to have their association, and also from the realization inside NEH that there was a point at which the councils needed to have their own association because we're talking about nonprofits and a federal agency. And after discussions inside the state humanities councils, the decision was made to move the Federation outside of Minnesota, kind of the middle of the country, where the American people are, we might say, to inside the Beltway, which is where the Congress is and where government is, and in the backyard of NEH itself. I hardly need say that kind of a decision is one that it's not an easy process to imagine what happens next. It really, in many ways, changed the picture. First of all, you're adding an entity that was initially fully supported by NEH, which serves the Humanities Councils. There's a little bit of a conflict in that, no? The dues are not paid fully by the Humanities Councils. It's largely with federal funds through NEH that is supporting this initial federation. So there's that. That's a little bit of a tension if you think about it. If, in fact, the Federation is a membership association of the Humanities Councils, there's a little bit of a problem in this organization. Second, as we know, as we've been talking about, there are really two dimensions to the work of the councils at the very least. One is that of building civil society and connecting the humanities to the public, and all the kinds of things that people have talked about here, connecting with scholars, encouraging public scholarship. The other side of that is the very harsh reality of what happens inside the Beltway. And these are all of the political issues that flow through Congress that come back and impact NEH, and which indirectly impact us. It's the latest crisis in a program that went bad, maybe in the arts or perhaps somewhere in the humanities. It's dealing with a member of Congress, and there are more than a few, who have not made their peace with the fact that in 1965, the federal government took the significant step of creating an agency of government that would fund culture. Very controversial proposition, even at the time that it got through in '65. So when you're looking at the situation here with the Federation moving from Minnesota to Washington, we're looking at a complicated reorganization of the relationship of the councils and NEH with this third entity called the Federation. And I would only just say that I think that Carole calls it a dance. It's a dance in terms of the relationship between the federal agency, which is a governmental agency, and nonprofit organizations, and there are federal laws that tell NEH what they can and cannot do. And at the same time, I'm sure that people inside NEH know that if one State Humanities Council project really goes wrong, really seriously wrong, it can have repercussions for everything. And at the same time, the Humanities Councils realized that who happened to be chair of NEH also had repercussions for them. So in some ways, I'm describing a situation where you've got the professional staff of the NEH in between the leadership of NEH, which is politically appointed, and the work of the Humanities Councils, which is at the local level. And then you have the Humanities Councils at the local level trying to figure out what do the 50 pieces or 56 pieces of this pie look like when you put them all together, and what does that have to do with a federal agency and an elective Congress? Folks, I mean, this is as complicated in politics as you can get. It really is. And when the Federation moved to Washington in 1986, it stirred all of that up all over again. It had a few years to get set, and then it got stirred up again. Now, I want to add one more complication to this picture. And by the way, the reason why I'm going into the complications is, aside from the fact that they were very real, I think they are, for the most part, behind us, but that raises the question of what should the future look like if we can redesign it, which is the question that I've posed. But then when the Federation does come to Washington with this encouragement by the board of the Federation to establish a national presence for the State Humanities Council. Remember that? That was what we were supposed to do, establish a national presence for the State Humanities Councils. Well, we've already got a national presence through the NEH. But then we come back to the problem of the NEH as a federal agency. What about these 50 nonprofit independent organizations? And besides, we now know that the National Endowment does a lot of things, one of which is to help support the Humanities Councils. And the Humanities Councils do a lot of things, not all of which the NEH would do. So we have really two very different creatures who are born on the same planet, who have to get along, who are mutually dependent, but different in status. And the Federation is right in the middle of that relationship. I will point out that one of the first things that happened in the first couple of years of the Federation is that the formal financial relationship between NEH and the Federation broke. And you can take a position on this. At the time, it was painful for everybody involved, but it was very evident that there were expectations that the Federation would advocate on behalf of the councils. And if there were federal funds in the Federation, as there were, then certainly direct federal funds through a contract with the Division of State Programs, then advocacy raises some red flags on the Hill. So you have to think about that. I mean, does the relationship with the NEH need to change? This was not necessarily something that was thought about, at the time, but until it moved. So there's that a little bit of a problem. The other problem is that if the Federation is the membership association of the State Humanities Councils, does that mean it is immediately responsible to the State Humanities Councils? I don't know how to describe this kind of a family. We've used analogies of parents and children, which I think sort of works for a little bit, but that doesn't quite work either. Just like the State Humanities Councils themselves and NEH are just sui generis, I think, in American history, and the State Humanities Councils are sui generis, I think, in history anywhere. This mix that landed in Washington beginning in 1986 is like nothing else in Washington either. So that is what I think for the first decade or so of the Federation's work it tried to do. It tried to sort out, and I'm speaking about this now from kind of where we sat, it's trying to sort out how do you keep friends with the NEH while also from time to time needing to say some things that the NEH may not want to hear. That's challenge number one. Challenge number two, How do you represent and advocate for the state humanities councils on Capitol Hill at the same time that you are trying to preserve some support for the whole idea of a national endowment for the humanities? Those interests are not always 100% working together. I think there are areas where sometimes, depending on if you're in the NEH or if you're in a state council, you might go this way or you not go that way. But then also realize that when you're working on Capitol Hill, you are playing with fire, and you can burn the house down. So there's the question of how do you do this on the Hill as well? And then it gets even more complicated because we shouldn't be talking to NEH about the work that we're doing on the Hill because that's a violation of the law too. And yet you can't not talk to the NEH because all your members receive their funding from them. So I think this is what kept some of us, gave us stomach aches quite a bit. I don't know what it was like on your end of the fence. There were a lot of meetings that happened outside of the old post office building. and I have a feeling that a lot of holding this whole house together depended ultimately on the very goodwill, I think this was pointed out by the acting chairman, the very goodwill and mutual support that we had for the whole enterprise, which was the value of the humanities in the United States. And I think that in more recent years, I think a lot of these bumps have been worked out. The Federation is 100% supported now through its members, the state humanities councils. The state humanities councils tell the Federation what to do. And by the same token, each state humanities council has its own relationship with the NEH. So it's complicated, but we've learned how to work together and how to play together. And I want to conclude on this note before I ask you folks to tell me how would you rewrite this relationship in the future to accomplish what? What is it that you would want to accomplish by moving forward? Because all of us are thinking about that. We're thinking about that in NEH. It's always on Carole's mind. We're thinking about that in each of the state humanities councils, and Esther spends lots of time talking to people, trying to keep all of these things moving together in the same direction. But I want to just sort of conclude on this note that I think, given the newness of the NEH, everybody was always very jittery about everything. And there's a house of cards that we've built here, and a bad move can bring it all down. I think what's really impressive, actually, is that when you really look at it, knowing that as human beings we will fight amongst each other, we hope not to use weapons, we will disagree. And there were disagreements, but nobody burned the house down. I mean, the wagons were always circled when they had to be. They were circled in the mid-90s. The NEH and the Humanities Councils, in my opinion, saved funding for the arts and the humanities. We know that the arts were in a place where they could not have a national voice at that time. They were, quote unquote, the problem. The Humanities Councils came forward and did some very major advocacy and frankly lobbying, and not them, but their board members. Because by this point, by the mid-90s, the board members of the state humanities councils are like some of you with Humanities Texas in this room, decision makers in your own state. You could pick up the phone and make the call to the member of Congress. And occasionally, that member of Congress was the chair of an appropriations committee or the chair of a subcommittee or in the leadership, and they did. They picked up the phone and the call was made. You weren't supposed to know about that, and so nobody talked to you about that. You're doing your own work on the Hill too. But I think what, as I look back, I appreciate is the maturity of that each of these units had, the state councils, the Federation, and the NEH, to work together essentially to save a common cause, because I think at core we were all working toward the same great thing. We didn't talk a lot about what that great thing is because you're too busy working. All of us were. But that gives me a great hope for the future of this partnership. Now, what it should look like is, and maybe we don't want to go down this path, I don't know. But I feel that with the pressures in the federal budget right now, in terms of financial pressures, the national priorities that are at play, we know that If we wanted to, if there was no National Endowment for the Humanities or the Arts, we wanted to invent one today, I think we all know we couldn't do it. So we are in another era. We're also in another era in terms of technology, in terms of the world that we live in. I mean, everything has changed in a very short period of time. How do we put this picture together if we're going to continue to work toward achieving the vision that we have in the humanities for creating a society that we all will be proud to live in and would want to live in? So I will just, and by the way, that's a suggestion. If you want to talk about other things, please feel free to. The tapes are running.
I'll weigh in with some risk, I think. I think that's a pretty good assessment of the way things have worked out over the last 40 years here. And my own view is that the state councils currently and continually have been too dependent on the NEH. I do not want in any stretch of the imagination to break the relationship. I see it as evolving into a partnership and a collaboration that also has a financial component, and that's where the dependency comes in. Though I do not think, and I disagree with many of our colleagues in this, that the NEH in any way imposes an agenda on any of us on the use of the funds that they provide for us, or in the relationship that would distinguish it in any way except as a partnership and a collaboration, certainly no longer, even if it ever was, a parent-child relationship. Certainly at the outset, they founded us. And that will always be the case, and there needs to be an acknowledgement that that is the case. But it's time for the future of the state councils to seek to develop themselves each in ways that go beyond what the NEH can and should do. And that we need also at the same time to say the NEH has an agenda, a role, a commitment, and a contribution to American society that goes beyond what a state council does or what the state councils as a group do or that the Federation does. And that's where this is a collaboration, symbiotic, but not dependent future.
Thank you, Rob.
I'll make one comment, Jamil, which has to do with the word advocacy. I think the Federation and the State Humanities Councils have really been very, very careful to ensure that the advocacy that has taken place has not been advocacy in a narrow sense. That is, it hasn't just been about support for an institution, for a state council. It hasn't been just about support for policies or certain programs. Self-interest, if you will. I think the advocacy, and I don't think I'm being too generous here, I hope I'm speaking really from the heart, that it has been about a much bigger story. That it really has been a story about the humanities and the American people. And we've felt that. And I think by and large, the councils have been able to convey that. And that as long as we focus on the really big picture, which was enumerated, Carole, in that legislation, about the humanities and the American people, the humanities and American democracy, that as long as we focus on that, I think we can escape the charge of advocacy of the narrow sense. And because that will kill us. That will kill every program, as you know. And I guess I would just say for all of us to kind of make sure we do our part to ensure advocacy of the big story.
Well, I'll just weigh in briefly here. When we think about Jamil's question, I'm sitting here saying, "Oh my goodness, what angle? Where do I start?" But one thing is to just state a fact, which is that NEH is mission is expressed through grant making. We started out and continue to be a grant-making agency. That's how I describe myself when I'm on the plane and someone asks me what we do. We make grants in various areas. And various chairmen will come along and will have an initiative or a theme, but 99% of what we do is make grants. And that reality constrains us and prevents us, I think, from doing some of the things that many people would like to see us do. We see our leadership through the various divisions through which we make grants. So working together with the state humanities councils, as they have become more operating foundations, and may tend to see us as the same. It's not. We make grants. That's what we do. So when we think about going together and partnership, that's what we need to keep in mind about our identity at NEH.
That's good.
It is important. I want to pick up on two words. One that I think Rob used, and Jim's word, advocacy. And the word that I think Rob used is maturity. I think, there was I keep referring in my own thinking about the councils and the NEH. I think that the pivotal moment was when when the Division of State Programs became the Federal State Partnership. That changed a lot of things. And many of those things weren't immediately noticeable, but over time, it is the appropriate relationship between, but that's such an important point, Carole, to bear in mind that the NEH is a grant-making agency, and that makes this partnership, no wonder we're having so much trouble always figuring it out, because the councils, through the partnership, would like to think of themselves as more than grantees. Yes. And they are. Yes. They are, but we need to bear in mind that still the NEH is a grant-making agency. But I think there's a maturity that has grown in both the councils and the NEH, frankly, since that moment when we declared ourselves not to be a granting agency and grantees, but rather a granting agency that has partners. Yes. And I think that maturity has continued to deepen all that time. Now, I agree with you, Rob, that it would be, and we're working on this all the time, for councils to be less dependent on the federal money and developing more other kinds of ways. But I wanted to also go back, Jim, to your word, advocacy, because I think you're absolutely right that to view that role for the councils and the Federation too narrowly is death. We cannot do that at all. But, I think a part of the council maturity, the growing council maturity, is to go back again to this issue that I did about the 10th anniversary of the councils. There was one person that, when I said to people, do you have any closing thoughts about things we ought to be thinking about over these coming years? One of the people that I talked to at that time said, well, I think after the last drink or the last cup of coffee, I think what everybody should be asking themselves about this work is, what have I done today for the humanities? I think what the councils say to them to themselves after the last drink and the last cup of coffee is, what have I done today for the American people? And I think that's where the advocacy really ought to be focused, is what are these programs doing for the American people?
Any follow-up comments or?
Well,
If I can make one comment.
Please do.
In the presence of Carole.
More than one.
And that is, if one looks at the number of grants awarded by state humanities councils and by the NEH, in the first 25 years of the Humanities Texas Council, some 1,600 grants were awarded. thousands and thousands of grants have been awarded by NEH. The astounding thing is that these grants have been made with only essentially positive results. That is, one does not find a record of Robert Mapplethorpe, as we recall that, in the 1990s with NEA. It's an astounding record in terms of public appreciation and of grants that only did good, really, and that you don't find newspapers picking up on the grants awarded by state humanities councils saying, isn't this a waste of federal dollars? It just hardly ever happens. And NEH's record is exemplary. I mean, to try to find a federal agency in which thousands and thousands of grants have been awarded over 50 years and not have that kind of result is just truly amazing, Carole. So.
Thank you. I just want to say one thing about the ways in which we try to talk about ourselves, like in terms of public humanities, the humanities moonlight, or, we're not on the campus, or this parent-child relationship that we don't really like with NEH and the councils. But I think, metaphorically, I think that Congress is the parent, and I think NEH is the midwife, and I think the councils are mature and are maturing and have always been the ones that reported back. I mean, I think we report back much more than the NEH does on the use of the NEH funds for us as grantees or as partners. So I keep thinking there's something in, Congress has a different character this 10 years and that 10 years. I feel like we need to give the parents some credit. And in a way that people like to be flattered, but also because it actually was the initiative, the councils in particular of Congress, to NEH, as I recall the early days, to start something.
I want to bring the Federation back into here, because when I was talking about NEH and the state councils themselves, but in two ways the Federation has been significant. Advocacy is clearly one of them. On behalf of us, the councils, on behalf of the NEH broader. And the other way, somebody mentioned earlier that we're constantly borrowing things from among ourselves, that there's a tremendous openness and collaboration among all of the states and a willingness to make available. There's very little proprietary interest at all, and that remains true. And in part it remains true because of the Federation as being the midwife, if you want to say, but the one that negotiates, that opens us to each other in many, many ways. And as I think all of us who work at the staff of the Virginia Foundation say repeatedly, we'll beg, borrow, and steal from anybody. And we're perfectly happy for them to beg, borrow, and steal from us. So we have a good program, it can be shared. You have a good program, we've probably stolen it somewhere along the way. And I could even name and cite names and numbers and references here, examples of it. So the Federation is really, itself has grown and matured dramatically. And its relationships, I think, with NEH and with the Congress benefit all of us every day of our working and other lives.
I was saying to Mike on the phone just last week that one of the really striking things to me about the councils over the years is at any given point, there are 2 or 3 councils that are noticeably doing something new and unusual. And they're not ever the same 2 or 3 councils. Somebody steps out, and then other councils kind of pick this up. And then the first conference that I ever came to, when I first started working to the Federation, Victor Swenson in Vermont gave a workshop on Let's Talk About It, which, as Kristina pointed out at that time, was, now it's so commonplace that we think it's old hat, but at that time, you remember Rachel Trickett, Jamil, who said she just couldn't get over this. She couldn't get over Victor's presentation and about this wonderful program he was talking about. And over the years, we've seen so many of these instances of somebody saying, I've got an idea, and then pretty soon the book festivals, the encyclopedias, the nobody's picked up backstory yet, but but I think that has been, I'm convinced that that has been one very key element in the success of the councils over all of these years, is the way that they have so freely, and also the way that they keep having good ideas.
Let me throw another question out here, and that involves scholars. We've talked a little bit about scholars. They make up portions of our boards. Our programs typically will involve a scholar or several scholars. The professional staff at the NEH are, for the most part, PhDs, people with graduate degrees in the humanities. And yet we also have lots of partners in the neighborhood. We have libraries, we have museums, we have historical societies, we have some of the media, particularly media like PBS and local PBS-affiliated stations. We've seen this whole world change and around us in the last 20 or so years, for sure. But we're also seeing some real stresses. We're seeing, certainly one stress is making our case with the public and how that comes across in terms of our appropriations in the Congress. So I guess one question I want to ask you is, how do you feel we have done, and I would say the three of us, in making our case to the public? And what do we feel about the way things are unfolding today, maybe in higher education? Jim, you talked a little bit about that, but also in the place of the humanities on the college campus, and maybe also the place of the humanities in other spheres, and bookstores perhaps, which in some sense everything is the humanities, in runaway, wild, public television programs that attract audiences of millions and millions, which we would say that's about the humanities. How do we, as we think about our future, on the one hand, we seem to be so desperate for the kind of funding support we would like to have publicly, and we're taking Rob's message to heart, which is we have to expand the base of our support as well. But with such pressure on us at this point, how do we move forward? I mean, do we need to remake ourselves? Do we need to work together in some new kinds of ways that we haven't had to up to this point? Is it that our society is not hearing us when we talk about why public support and state support for the humanities is so important? It's very apparent that at the state level, a lot of us have taken some very big hits in terms of our public funding. We had a very good period up until about 6 or 7 years ago, and then with the recession, a lot of us have lost money. Some of us have lost every penny of state funding. We're all competing against all these nonprofit organizations that no longer that didn't exist when we first came around. Now, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of nonprofit organizations in Texas, in Georgia, in Virginia, in Illinois, and we're all competing for the same. I just would like you to sort of think a little bit about, as we look down the road, how do we work together and in dealing with some of the stresses and some of the challenges to the business that we've got going. Would the audience like to respond?
Is that okay, Mike?
Is that okay? Betty Sue.
I think one of the issues is that the public doesn't know, like the fish swimming in the ocean, the public doesn't know that it's swimming in the humanities. So it's hard to make a case about offering something distinctive when we're in the middle of it all the time. So the issue is how do we underscore the distinction of the gift that the humanities, as we define them with the NEH and the state councils, how do we make that distinction such that we say, these humanities that you're swimming in all the time, this is how this helps this life that you're already always in?
Some responses? How do we do it? It's a good question.
Well, I'm not sure this responds exactly to it, but I think we're so used to sort of pushing information out that even when we're promoting ourselves, we're always, and we find it very hard to say, oh, yes, we do this. We would say, well, yes, we do this, but not everywhere and not at all this, every time and not, maybe here or there. I mean, I don't think that we have the language that invites people into an experience, which then can be, I don't know if distinguished, but just makes people aware of the water around them if we're a fish, if we're going to carry it on that way. And I don't necessarily think that means we change what we do, but I think maybe it's of all the advocacy work that we're always doing, or writing grant proposals or whatever, we're in a very instrumental way of talking about the work or trying to make a case to each other or to the academy or to the thinking, so that, we know all that, we have all that, we have to find a better language and put a different hat on for bringing people in who aren't already in.
This doesn't exactly fit, but sometimes when you're doing planning, you're told to imagine, you have twice as much or 5 times as much as you have now. What would you do? And you express whatever your values are by those choices. We had the opposite experience in which we lost nearly over 40% of our funding, and were therefore forced to see what our core values were by what we kept and what we had to let go. And so at this point, and it's somewhat of an answer to your question about the future, Jamil, I think that at this stage, we're pretty sure that we made those choices and that they were the right ones, and that if we were to sustain, say, percentage reduction again, we would probably, if it weren't too large, be sure that we're in the areas that we should be in. And if we were lucky enough to have increases, then we would go out from that core base. So I think there's a lot of confidence that what we're doing now in the areas in which we are operating, we're pretty sure that those choices were the right ones, and we're working on those. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but in some ways, Betty Sue, I think it kind of keys off something that you offered.
I think one of the roles that the humanities play, and I think all of us play within our communities, is the questioning role. My own view is the humanities are incessant questioning questions, and try to live that out, even to being obnoxious about it to other people. And it's a way of getting people to come back to you with, what does it mean to be swimming in the sea and not know whether you're there or not? Things emerge from those kinds of conversations. Let them tell us. We don't have all the answers along the way. And a recent example, not necessarily questioning, but I was asked to speak. The subject was assigned to me, talk about the role of the humanities, what the humanities can contribute to Southwest Virginia. Southwest Virginia's coal fields, relatively poor area, but rapidly developing. And so I did. I came and talked about it. And it was a reasonably good talk, I would say. But the person who followed me, who was local, had grown up there, but had been away and come back. He had been in mining and that kind of activity his entire career. And he stood up and he told a story that illustrated everything that I just tried to say and that everybody got. I felt entirely, useless at that point in the whole thing. But I was also educated, even in my advanced years. It was an astonishing presentation, very passionate, very heartfelt, very, very much in the humanities. So how do we get people to tell those kinds of stories to us, which open us to what in this case, I should have been talking about, and left to him. He demonstrated the passion, he demonstrated the love that is inherent in the humanities when it is well presented.
I would add that it's quite important to have a language, vernacular, if you will, but I think concomitant to that would be ambassadors who go forth and articulate what we do and how we can make an impact on varying communities. And the model for me, frankly, is what has happened in El Paso. We see Humanities Texas really being revered on the campus because of work leading up to where we are now, and the fact that we've had people on the board who've gone through a transformative experience in their own appreciation of the humanities, and they go back. And the gentleman to my right, Mr. Sam Moore, is an example. We have Jackson Curlin in El Paso. We have Adair Margot. We have the president of the university, all of whom speak highly of Humanities Texas. So one direct result of it is that we probably apply for much more money than we did in the past. But the good news is that we know where Humanities Texas is located and what are the resources and how we can apply for those resources. So I think creating ambassadors, very important.
I would add one thought, which really has to do with other institutions, collaborators and partners. State Humanities Councils, I think, have grown in terms of their ability to work with libraries and museums and historical societies. And I think to tell the story about what might happen from a negative standpoint, if certain grants can't be made to the library or to the museum, if indeed there are a lack of funds and a lack of activities, that can impact the local library, the local museum, or positively, if those institutions can provide grant applications and receive funding, they can change the institution as well. So I think to bring collaborators and partners into that dialogue at the local level is also quite important.
One thing that I don't want to leave this session without saying is the impact of programs that the state councils have funded, the impact that they have had on what happens at the endowment. And there are many, many, many. So let me just mention one example, and that is what the state councils have been doing with regard to returning military veterans. Just marvelous programs in which veterans' writings have been used in reading and discussion programs. Various works of literature have been used with caregivers in military facilities. And these projects that are disparate and around the country are both replicated in other state councils, but then have an impact on NEH, sometimes funded by us, sometimes not, but they go into our head, into our thinking. And after several years of many of these successful programs, now we're thinking about how we can be more intentional. And one thing that we can do is say we're interested. No money attached, but think about this and come to the regular programs and research and public programs in the education division because NEH is interested. And we're working out now how, as I said, we could be more intentional in that area. And I believe it's going to be an enormously important aspect of what we are going to be doing over the next few years. Stay tuned.
I hope all of us are thinking about what we're going to be doing over the next 10 years, or even 40 years. We were having that conversation at lunch today.
Well, one of the things that I take from both of these comments is that we're entering another era. I think we know that. The world that created the NEH, is the world that had, 3 national broadcasting systems on television, and there was only one television in the house. And if you wanted to,
Very small.
and it was small. If you wanted to buy a book, you knew the bookstore in town that you had to go to buy it, and maybe they would have to order it, and you'd wait 3 weeks, but that was okay. You were willing to wait 3 weeks to get the book that you want. We're living in a different world. And I did want to just pick up on something that you said, Carole, that seems to me to be maybe perhaps something like the conclusion that we're coming to on this panel, and that is that circling the wagons, working together, realizing that the things that hold us together are much greater than the things that might keep us from working together. And so I just applaud the thinking that you're talking about here inside the NEH, the thinking of working, that partnerships can work across divisions within NEH. And then also, I think that in recent years, the relationship between NEH and the Federation and the Humanities Councils has really moved forward in terms of also talking and working together. And maybe, given the scarcity of resources and the brainpower that you have in NEH and in the state humanities councils, perhaps we can learn how to work together. I think at the end of your comment, you said there may not be money there, but what we also know is it's not just about the money. The money are the means for helping us get things done. But we also all know lots of people. We just heard that we know lots of people. We know people in, the state the Rolodex, we don't use them anymore, but if we did, the Rolodex of a state humanities council staff member or executive director would be like none other in the state of Texas. We know that. You can get right to where you want to go and to the right person and to the right organization. And we know no other Rolodex like that exists. And in many ways, the NEH can do the same. And I'm wondering in the levels that it's working in terms of, especially in terms of higher education and major cultural organizations that are nationally significant. I'm wondering if maybe our next challenge here is, having all been able to get ourselves to this point and having survived some challenges to our very existence and having overcome them largely by working together, and now we're facing a new kind of, certainly a new financial era, but also an era of technology and so many other changes happening around the world, that if maybe this is the time to really build on the mutual goals and strengths that we have. And if this is really worth our time in, as a federation and as an endowment to think about. As we broach that, as we put that out on the table, we also have to realize is that nobody has a magic wand that can make it happen, because these are, after all, the president appoints chair of NEH or the acting chair of NEH. Humanities councils have boards, and they live inside their state boundaries, and they're not always thinking about the things that we're talking about here. And they're always, they're working with the Federation and putting demands on the Federation. But I do think that maybe we're moving into an era now of, I would hope, a kind of a unity where we think about how it is that we can work together. I will say, just as a reminder to all of us, that when we do that, it's a give and take. It doesn't mean that we come with hand out to the NEH. It means that we come really with a hand that can shake one another. So I hope that as we look at the Federation of State Humanities Councils, NEH, and the state councils, we realize that our future, for better or for worse, is probably in our hands, and not in the hands of others, not in the hands of higher education, not in the hands of the library system, and I would also have to say, not in the hands of the U.S. Congress, because the U.S. Congress ultimately is a responsive institution. It's what we have to say that can help shape our future. That maybe maybe we're in an era now of where we realize, where we can capitalize on all that we have in common, and frankly on the desperation of our society for what it is that we have, what it is that we have to offer. That is not a closing remark. Any questions? Any comments from people on the panel or anything like that? Yes, sir.
And how do we make it succinct so that after 2 or 3 minutes, people will say, this is really important? And why is it important? what's the difference between when I first got on the board, I got that big book and I started saying, well, exactly what is the humanities? And how does that differ from liberal arts? And I think we need to go into and think about what is it that we do that is of value? What is it that we teach people? Why do people benefit from the humanities? And then from there, we can raise a whole lot more money, and we can figure out ways. It doesn't matter who gets the credit as long as the money comes in. But I think we need to do some hard work, and trying to reduce something down to a succinct message is hard work. It's the story. I'm sorry I took a long time to tell you this, but I couldn't think of a short way to say it. So anyway, that's my suggestion about we need to explain what the humanities is and why it's important that it be funded, and then use these councils from the ground up. When Mike and I were trying to raise a little money for the building, we would go to people and say, what is, here we go, we'd like for you to give some money to a Humanities Texas building. People's jaw would drop. They didn't know what Humanities Texas was. So anyway, that's my suggestion.
Very good, thank you. Excellent.
I actually think that is one of the biggest challenges we have faced throughout the entire history of the NEH, just that.
It's remarkable, isn't it? All of us work with words.
Yeah.
But you're right, it is a challenge we've yet to meet.
I think the starting point for that perhaps could be the legislation itself, the first 2 pages of the legislation, and rewrite it to make sense. I mean, it makes sense to all of us to some extent, but if you took the beauty and the power of that language, and it is, I think it is beautiful, and I think it is powerful, but it needs updating, and it needs simplifying if one's going to get that message out. But it is a starting point, and I think a very powerful starting point. So I guess maybe I would say a little revisiting of that preamble to the National Foundation on the Arts and the Humanities of 1965 might be worthwhile to achieve that goal.
I wonder, I really don't want this to be a last word, but I wonder if a part of it, this is a problem we sure are struggling with, but I wonder if a part of that problem isn't exactly what Betty Sue is talking about, is there is this water we all swim in, and it's pretty hard to gather that up and define what that is, because all of us, not just the people in this room, but all of the people we work with out in the communities are swimming in that water all the time, and wow, that is hard to define.
Whatever it is, I do have a slogan for us. May the force be with us. I think on that note, we're right at...
And it's an important misquotation.
Yes.
Because I think it really goes, may the force be with you.
I like that, Betty Sue. I like that very much. I did stick the S in there, that's true, but you're right. May the force be with you.
The American people.
The American people, exactly. That is the point, isn't it? Thanks so much, everybody.